Hello, my name is Klinik Natalia Petru, and I am an economist working as a postdoc at the Department of Planning Regional Development at the University of Thessaly, Greece. I would like to welcome you to our ESSPIN open access online courses about inequality. To give you some background, ESSPIN is a research project funded by the European Commission Horizon program, focusing on studying the economic, social, and spatial inequalities in Europe. Our research has been going on for 3 years and has now been concluded. And it's the outcome of the collective effort of 13 universities and research organizations. So we would like to share with you some of our findings, and we hope that you will find those useful. This specific course, the specific lecture, will focus on climate change and income inequalities, which was part of the work of the project. And in general, this work is focused on the interconnection of free market drivers and its impact on inequality. So for this specific lecture, we will focus on climate change and income inequality and its potential interconnection. To start with, I'll give you some background on this issue. So of course, many of us already know climate change has been seen during the times of the 21st century. We can always notice issues of climate change affecting more and more people, and also we notice in our everyday life the impact of climate change. It affects all levels of society, social, political, geopolitical, and humanitarian as well. It is not merely a threat to our ecosystems, but also threatens fundamental human rights, and it tends to increase inequality and injustice among people. Some potential climate change occurrences are higher temperatures, rising sea levels, and desertification, depending on which area of the world we are focusing on, because global north and global south countries face different problems from climate change. We can notice that climate change has a different effect on the different social and spatial groups. Generally, those who are at the bottom of the distribution suffer more and blue areas. And here the difference that generally the wealthy choose for pollution. So, the 40% of the population and only 12% of the global emissions in 2018, whereas the top 10% emitted 48% of the total emissions. So here exactly we can see different approach in reducing suffering from climate change. Of course, the impacts of climate change are not only now, they affect also the future generations, and they affect not only the place where the actual pollution is created, but can also have worldwide impact and effects. Generally, inequalities are increased through climate change because the poorest population is more exposed to these events. They suffer greater losses in terms of their income and wealth, and they also have fewer resources to recover from the impact of climate change. A lot of researchers have focused on this specific topic, and of course, and the relationship between climate change and income inequality. Diverse results in the research. For instance, some researchers, natural disasters, increase income inequality in the short term, but this is a so, others, on the other hand, the sector and live in rural areas. You can see the different approach of the areas that you need to say in this case. For instance, or approach. The previous research had focused on specific regions and more local focus. So of course, if we take a local or global approach into account, the climate change and natural disasters and income inequality. Moreover, a recent research by Zapata found that natural disasters affect income inequality in a positive manner, especially when they have impact on specific infrastructure like roads, infrastructure, and assets, and do not see such a big impact when human losses are taken into account. Researchers have focused on identifying the exact relationship between income gaps and Gini coefficient, which is a measure of accounting for income inequality, and have found that indeed these income gaps tend to increase CO2 emissions and worsen environmental quality. In connection with this, of course, it's also the topic of gender equality and inequality. Generally, gender inequality is positively associated with income inequality, meaning that women suffer more of income inequalities, and also it has been proven that women suffer more from the effects of climate change because they're more exposed to this, and it has proven that men are more climate change than women. So this is also a factor that we will take into account in the research, the gender equality, and that's why all this literature has helped us formulate our approach into studying this specific topic. So we have formulated a few research questions that have been the focus of our work. The first one is if inequality is affected by climate change when considering that both variables are endogenous. This means that climate change is being considered here as an endogenous variable, which is affected by the current development and development model, meaning a model where industrialization and globalization are very much evident. In the same context, we are going to study also how is climate change affected by inequality. So our main approach is to study if there is actually a two-way causal relationship between climate change and income inequality, and how all these this relationship is affected by other factors of our modern society. So to give you a background again about what we exactly studied in this report that we produced, we explored the impact of climate change on income inequality, and the novelty here is that we used both within and between country income inequality. In this sense, within country income inequality will be measured by Gini, which is the most commonly used measure of inequality. It takes values from 0 to 1, 0 implying complete equality and 1 implied complete inequality. Also, we have constructed a novel measure, the rich to poor ratio, which is the ratio between the share of income of the 1% of the population, the richest one, and the share of income of the bottom 50%. With the use of the rich to poor ratio, we intend to capture also extreme income inequality, because Gini mostly covers the middle class and takes an average picture of the income inequality, whereas the rich to poor ratio tends to cover more the extreme part of the income inequality. At the same time, we will also use between country income inequality with the assistance of the GDP per capita gap. So we calculated this gap from the distance of each country from the top income country, and we found this GDP per capita gap. And of course, the main also variable that we will use is climate change, which will be translated into environmental pollution, and namely the CO2 emissions per capita. Of course, we recognize that there are various greenhouse gases that affect climate change and contribute to it. We have decided here to use CO2 as a proxy because it is the most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas. Its amount in the atmosphere has increased massively in the last 200 years and is the main cause of the extreme weather events that we are noticing and the climate changes that we are noticing. It's a gas that traps the heat of in the atmosphere and creates the so commonly noticed heat waves, droughts, and generally extreme weather events. So we have decided to use CO2 as a good indicator of environmental pollution. As I said before, we are considering environmental pollution to be an endogenous variable being affected by the existing development model. So in this slide, we can also see the general variables that we used. I will describe them also along with the results in a few slides. Just for a general background, we used data from various global sources like the World Bank, the World Inequality Database, the IMF, for a period of 33 years from 1990 to 2022. And for 167 countries, which captures about 96% of the global population. So we tried to cover as many countries as possible, of course, based on the data availability, as we wanted to take a global picture and explore this two-way causal relationship at the global level. We've used a variety of variables in our research, from economic side, pre-market, post-market drivers, and of course, climate change and extreme weather events. As a general background here, before going into the specifics of our research, I wanted to show you a slide that we can see on this graph the evolution of CO2 emissions per capita in the different income groups. These income groups derive from the World Bank, so all countries are divided according to their income level. This is based on the 167 countries that we examined. And of course, as expected, we can see that CO2 emissions per capita are higher in higher income countries. And the bottom, at the bottom, we can see the low income ones. And in between the lower and upper middle income countries, of course, this was expected. What we can notice as well is that in 2008, 2009, when the financial crisis hit all countries worldwide, there has been a slight decrease in CO2 emissions in high income and upper middle income countries. And we can also notice that from then on, there has been a slight increase, but from 2020, so according to like preliminary research based on the COVID-19 experience, we can also notice here that CO2 emissions per capita have started to decrease again. Of course, levels are still very high of the CO2 emitted in the atmosphere, so all countries need to lower their emissions in order to achieve the set goals for the Sustainable Development Goals and also the European goals set in the EU. It is also interesting to see in this scatter plot the evolution of CO2 emissions per capita and the relationship with Gini. We can notice here that there is a U-shaped relationship between income inequality and CO2 emissions, implying that at first, with the rising levels of Gini, there is a CO2 emissions tend to decrease, and then again, as Gini rises, CO2 emissions increase again. So we will see if also our results prove this kind of relationship. With regards to the development level, we can see that there is a potential conditionality of the effect of development levels between and the effect on CO2 emissions and income inequality. We can see that high-income countries tend to have higher CO2 capita emissions with the rise of their Gini levels, whereas the opposite relationship is noticed especially for upper middle and lower middle income countries. So these slides are basically like such a background to have in mind for the research and the data results that will follow. To start, before going to the results, the specifics, just to give you a short background, we used a three-state least square panel model so that we can account for this endogenous relationship character of the variables taking into consideration, and also to capture the indirect effects of the drivers leading to climate change and inequality. As I mentioned before, the endogenous variable are Gini, RTP, development gaps, and CO2. And we want to account for this effect of climate change on inequality and the opposite relationship as well, and also the effect of extreme weather events on inequality and CO2. Therefore, we have created three different approaches, three different equations here. So the first one deals with, in the 3SLS approach, focuses on the part of inequalities as the dependent variable. And we have a few independent variables that we take into consideration, like gender equality, globalization, corporation taxes, drought, and also a multiplicative term of CO2 and the development level, mainly GDP per capita. And also in the second part of the 3SLS approach, we use CO2 as the dependent variable. And as the independent variables, we have industry share, agriculture share, energy intensity, forest area, trade tax, fires, and trade gravity index, as well as population density. It's important here that we have incorporated trade, and because it's one of the main sources of rising CO2 levels, mainly due to the shipping and air costs involved. Of course, trade has been increasing in the recent years with the globalization effect, and also because more people demand more and higher distribution of goods. But at the same time, this increase in trade has increased CO2 emissions as well. At the same time, we take into consideration the trade gravity index, which measures the geographic reach of trade. So in this sense, this index captures not only the trade volumes, but also the distance covered by the trade in question. So we try to incorporate also this fact that trade creates CO2 emissions, and try to incorporate this in our research. The following settings use similar independent variables, but in the following two parts, we use RTP and the development gap as the dependent variable, and the second part of the equation is the same. We will start by focusing on the first parameter, which is here we have the RTP results. So we can see that, first of all, we have created 7 different models, and we have used a few different variables in each case to see the possible effects of each one on our dependent variable. We can see that there is a robust U-shaped form of U-shaped relationship between the level of development, so GDP per capita, and RTP. So there is a turning point above which the rise of the rise of development level tends to affect negatively inequality, but after a point, the rise in development level positively affects income inequalities. So we notice here that the threshold level is at around 86,000 USD. So meaning that above that level, with the rise of development, also inequalities increase as well. We see that there is a positive relationship between CO2 emissions and income inequality, which is valid throughout most models. Also, government expenditure is negatively associated with income inequality, meaning that a stronger public sector tends to decrease income inequalities. The corporate taxes seem to have a negative effect on income inequalities. And the gender equality also has a negative effect on income inequality. So the more equal the society, the less the income inequality as well. Globalization has a positive effect here, according to our results. We notice also here that there is a positive side of globalization involved. As expected, drought has a positive effect on income inequality as well. So extreme weather events negatively affect income inequalities. That the higher the drought, the higher the income inequality. It's interesting to notice here that the multiplicative term of CO2 emissions and development level. So in this case, the impact of we can see that the impact of on the RTP may be conditioned by the level of development. So more advanced countries tend to face more serious issues in terms of climate change. In the second part of the equation, we have CO2 as the dependent variable. And as I said, we take also a few independent variables into consideration. As expected, the level of development has a positive effect on CO2 emissions. The industrialization, the higher the industrializations, the higher the CO2 emissions. Of course, this makes sense. And the lower the agriculture and the higher the agricultural sector, the lower the CO2 emissions are at the same time. This makes sense if we take into consideration that from the industry sector, the most part of the CO2 emissions comes from the industrial sector, whereas only a small part comes from the agricultural one. Energy is accounted for with the variable energy intensity. So the higher the energy intensity, the higher the CO2 emissions as well. Of course, as expected, there's a negative relationship between forest area and CO2 emissions. So the higher the forest area, the less the CO2 emissions. This makes sense again because forests capture CO2 and help regulate the oxygen levels in the atmosphere. Trade tax here has a negative effect on CO2 emissions. A lot of countries have established a trade tax recently to both protect their domestic trade and generate more revenue in their own territories. And it's we can see that there is that the higher the trade tax, the lower the CO2 emissions. Fires, which is an extreme weather event, as expected, increases CO2 emissions. And we can also notice a positive relationship between trade gravity and CO2 emissions. So this is very important because not only the volume of trade matters, but also the distance covered by trade. Also, we have noticed that the population density is positively associated with CO2 emissions, meaning that there is a more intensive exploitation of resources in highly populated areas. We have also examined the impact of inequality on CO2 levels. We have, in its case, the RTP, the Gini, or the development gap. And we can see that there is a potential nonlinear relationship here involved. Basically, this has to do more with the levels of consumption in its country. If there is and usually, if there is an increase in luxury consumption, we can see that this affects this relationship, and the level of inequality severely affects CO2. So this is the case for the RTP. In the case of Gini, we can see more or less similar results. Of course, the threshold levels slightly differ, but this is also expected because different indicators are taken into account. And so we can see that, for instance, just to know something here, we have taken into account both the effect of Gini on CO2 emissions and the effect of multiple Gini and development level. So we can see that Gini negatively affects CO2 emissions, but when taking into consideration also the development level, we can see that it positively affects CO2 emissions for countries with a level of GDP GDP per capita higher than $15,000. So this covers most part of the countries examined. So we can see that there is a positive effect here with when the multiplicative term is taken into consideration and the development level is accounted for as well. In terms of the development gap, which is a measure of between-country inequality, so we can see that the development gap decreases as the development level increases. So here, countries with which are at the low or middle income group have a development choice to make, either to grow fast and reach the higher income countries, or stay as they are, because of course there is a trade-off to make here, because as expected, there is a positive conditionality of CO2 and development level with the gap. So for higher levels of development will bear also higher environmental costs. So poorer countries have a trade-off to make, to either increase their development level, but also account for the environmental pollution and cost involved, and find a way to reduce the gap, but also bear the environmental costs that may occur. So we can also see that once the gap, the effect of the development gap on CO2 emissions is negative. So the higher the gap, the less the CO2 emissions. And this is valid for a development gap level of 2.87. So the larger the gap, the smaller the impact on environmental degradation. So basically, for any value of GDP per capita, the effect is positive on CO2 emissions. All these models have given us a few have given some information about the relationship between climate change and income inequality. It is novel in the sense that we used air pollution as a climate change proxy as an endogenous variable, which is determined by by key market drivers and policy drivers as well. The evidence suggests that environmental degradation increases inequality. Of course, as we said, the low end of the distribution is affected more. And income inequality is driven by many internal and external dynamics, such as development level, technology, and globalization, as well as pre-market and post-market drivers like government expenditure and taxation. Governments have have to take into account the technological processes involved in key sensitive sectors. So it is essential for each country to think about the potential greening sensitive sectors and focusing more on renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. So there has not involved in this case, but it's essential to find a good balance between technological advancement and greening also the economy. At the same time, we have proven that trade negatively affects the CO2 emissions. So also here there's a trade-off between advancing trade and increasing trade volumes, but at the same time accounting for the environmental externalities that have occurred. So especially for the less advanced countries, there is they have the potential to reduce their development gap from the more advanced countries and to follow the current pollution generating growth trade model. But they have to be here, it has to be here clear that they need to account for the negative environmental externalities. Otherwise, CO2 emissions especially will rise to an unexpected level. With regards to the public sector, of course, countries with a stronger public sector are in a better position to deal with both the increasing inequality levels and the environmental threats. Taxes can help compensate for the environmental damage of trade. So it would be good to develop more environmental taxes and also more adaptive income climate policies that target green investment and public intervention. So this can have effects reducing both the climate threat and income inequality. And the green and inclusive policies will need to be designed in coordination, and it's essential to take into account that income inequality and environmental degradation are very much connected and reinforcing each other. So addressing the needs, addressing one requires addressing the other one as well in order to have a good, solid basis to develop further for each country. So, of course, the level of development of each country is dependent on the policies that each country can take. Generally, as a suggestion, we need to change the technological process and the trade process involved and develop more strict climate policies that are inclusive and will help reduce both levels of CO2 emissions and also the level of income inequality worldwide. So this has been the lecture today about the relationship and the relationship between climate change and inequalities. You can find also the complete publication in the Journal of Sustainable Development on this topic. I hope you found this lecture useful, and of course, you can always contact us for any questions or further details you may need. Thank you very much.